Hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you today, albeit virtually. I am Bill Hintz. I am an assistant professor at the University of Toledo's Lake Erie Center, and one aspect of my research is about salt pollution and from the various sources of salt pollution and the environmental and ecological impacts. I wish I could be there in person today. Unfortunately, scheduling just didn't work out. But feel free to contact me. I'll provide my information at the end of this talk if you have any questions or want to discuss anything further. So when we think about salt pollution, kind of as this, it's not necessarily an emerging contaminant, but it's something we're becoming more aware of over the last decade or so. And so we really do have a salt problem. And when we talk about salt pollution, sometimes we call it salinization or freshwater salinization. And this can occur from a variety of sources. There's agricultural induced salinization from fertilizers and irrigation practices. There's mining induced salinization, where we pull a massive amount of material out of the earth and that contains salts. And when it rains or snows or any kind of precipitation, that will dissolve and wash into our streams, rivers, and lakes. There's climate change induced salinization, where we have this issue with sea level rise. So salt water is kind of penetrating our coasts a little bit more. And so that is contaminating coastal freshwater ecosystems with essentially ocean water, right? And fresh, groundwaters near the oceans. And then there's kind of the focus of today's workshop, which is road salt induced desalinization. And so I'll talk a little bit more about some of the research we've done on this topic. So, first, to start, road salts are very necessary for human safety. And I think that's an important point we all need to fully understand. As a scientist, I am not interested in pointing fingers at anyone, but when we think about issues like road salt pollution, that it keeps my family and my friends safe, your family and your friends safe during winter conditions here in Ohio and many U.S. states. And so some of the evidence suggests that road salts reduce accident rates by 78 to 87% on our highways. And so when we think about the issue of salt pollution or road salt pollution more specifically, we have to understand there's this human aspect of it, right? That our safety is critically important. So we have to find that balance between salt pollution and kind of the environmental and ecological impacts, if you will. So when we think about the need for road salt in the United States, I mean, it's broad. 70% of the roads in the United States and 70% of the US population lives in areas that get snow and ice. Okay. So when we reduce accident rates in these regions, I mean, think about all the people we're keeping safe, right? And so we need to maintain that aspect of this conversation. When we think about how much road salt is applied, it can be a lot. And so when we look from 1975 to about 2017, the amount of just sodium chloride, rock salt essentially, or halite, used as a road deicer, in some years, with severe winter weather and longer winters, I mean, about 66 billion pounds of just NaCl can be applied on our roads. I'm originally from Minnesota, so I like to use the kind of proverbial term UFTA. That's a lot of salt that will eventually wash into our groundwaters, our surface waters, our streams, our lakes, and our wetlands. Okay. If we try to contextualize this a little bit further, I have a pretty small kitchen table. It's about a yard by a yard or something like that. Um, but when we think about how much road salt is applied in some US states, it can be upwards of 18 pounds of salt on a small kitchen table. Just think about, a square meter or a square yard, right? That's a lot of salt. So take your table salt and dump 18 pounds of it in the middle of a small kitchen table, and that's how much can be applied to that area of road in any given year. So around the world in cold regions, there's a lot of salt going down. This is where I work. This is where I try to study the ecological impacts of road de-icing salts. That white on that sidewalk and that parking lot, it's not snow, it's salt, right? This is from a private applicator at the Lake Erie Center here at the University of Toledo. I was working over one Christmas break and This day happened to be about 38 degrees Fahrenheit. It was predicted to have winter weather. Unfortunately, it stayed at about 38 or 39 degrees Fahrenheit, and we got rain. So, all of this salt that you see here on these parking lots, it wasn't really used for any de-icing purpose. It was basically washed into the adjacent, freshwater ecosystems. And if you look at the photo on the right there over those pines, that's Lake Erie. So, um, now imagine stuff like this, happening decade after decade, and then things like that, just to contextualize this a little bit more. The state of Ohio, in a recent Clear Road survey, it ranked as high as number three in the country for total road salt use. We get some pretty severe winter weather here, being right on a Great Lake and stuff like that. So this fluctuates a lot, and survey to survey, year to year, this can change. But the highest I've ever seen Ohio rank is number three, and that was as recently as 2017. So I like to ask, why so much salt? And I think me, you, the general public, anybody, just point in the mirror, right? I mean, it's not the applicator's fault. It's not road manager's fault. It's not necessarily DOT or something like that, but it's our demand for clean, safe roads, free of ice, free of snow, that level of service that can really kind of trigger us to apply a lot more salt than is necessary. Now, we all have a role in understanding the ecological environmental impacts, and we all have a role in trying to use salt in a very smart way. So we'll talk a little bit about that today, and I'll let others in the workshop discuss that as well. But when we think about our Great Lakes, which is the most valuable freshwater resource on the planet, right? There have been papers published that show, if you look at the y-axis here is just the chloride concentration in the top graph and sodium concentration in the bottom. And Stephen Chopra and company have published really a series of papers. And when you look at like the red line or the white triangles here, on both of these graphs, you can see that Lake Erie, especially, and Lake Ontario have seen massive increases in their chloride concentration. Now, when we think about how much salt it takes to increase the salt concentration of Lake Erie or any Great Lake, it's mountains of salt. And so a brilliant scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Hillary Dugan, and some members of her lab, and at other places, actually calculated how much salt is going into Lake Michigan. Now, we use chloride as a good surrogate for salt pollution because it typically is not biologically transformed in too many different ways. It's a good tracer of anthropogenic or human induced salt pollution. So, what they calculated going into Lake Michigan is, I mean, it's north of 2 billion pounds of salt per year of just chloride, mind you, and that's another conversation we can have, of just chloride. And so it's literally mountains and mountains of salt every single year going into our Great Lakes. Now, when that happens year after year, that's a little worrisome, right? And we know our Great Lakes, especially in this area, are affected by other things like invasive species. There's warming waters due to climate change, and there's a whole host of other contaminants affecting our Great Lakes. And so salt is just one of them. But to kind of put some numbers on this, there's a lot of salt going into our Great Lakes. And once salt gets in, it's very hard for us to get it out. Really, there's no economically feasible way for us to make our fresh waters fresh again once salt's in them. We have to wait it out, and the old kind of saying of dilution is the solution to pollution. Well, dilution is the solution to salt pollution. So I don't know if we want to wait for ecological and environmental impacts to occur. I think it's time we do something about this now. Now, I'm based out of Toledo at the University of Toledo's Lake Erie Center, and I just wanted to show you some of the salt concentrations we're measuring over in our area. And so, City of Toledo kind of being the top center of the graph here. We don't have any natural salt deposits over this way, and so our geology is kind of free of salt deposits. Most of those are over, your way in Cleveland and kind of run under Lake Erie and go up through Michigan. So, nat what you see here are different dots, and if you can see color, you see green, yellow, orange, and red dots. And so, each one of those dots is one of our study sites. And in this area, the the natural salt concentration should be about 6 milligrams of chloride per liter or less. So next to each one of those dots is the chloride concentration. So at all of those dots where you might see a 351, a 156, a 21, or a 349, a 52, or 162, right? All those numbers should probably be less than 6 historically, naturally, okay? So there's a lot of salt pollution going on here in northwestern Ohio, and this is pretty characteristic of, any metropolitan area. Large cities and things like that can use a lot of salt. So, yeah, the concentrations indicate that there is a pretty large problem over here as well. So what my lab does is we ask the question, when salt gets into the water, how are the organisms affected? And so that's one of the driving questions of my research lab. And so to get into it a little bit, I would just preface one other thing going back is that in freshwater ecosystems, everything is interconnected. And this is what I tell my ecology students, right, in my lectures, is that everything is connected. Think about it as one big complex array of dominoes. And if you push one domino over, how many dominoes are going to fall? And so think of the ecological impacts kind of like that. That's what we study. When we think about some species, yellow perch, and a critically important species in this region. Previously, when I was in New York, I was working in the Adirondack parks, and the yellow perch is a prized kind of game fish out there too, right? I mean, I love these things that take the fillets just like walleye, batter them, beer batter, and fry them up, and it's some of the best fish dinners you've ever had. So, um, but what we find is that when we increase the salt concentration, some of the data are shown here on the right. When we increase the salt concentration on the x-axis there, we see a decline in some of the food resources kind of prized by yellow perch, right? So these little things called amphipods or scuds, um, they're kind of, most people don't care about them, don't see them ever, but they're an important part of the ecosystem. They're an important food resource for a lot of different fish species. But once we get to a certain salt concentration, we see a noticeable decline in their abundance. And so that begs the question like, well, okay, this inconspicuous species might be affected by high salt concentrations. So, how are the fish affected by high salt concentrations, right? Everything's connected. When we do our field work on yellow perch, we find that these amphipods are a critically important food resource. So, what you're seeing here is what we would call a food web. And the yellow perch kind of being at the top of the food web and all the different lines is exactly what the yellow perch eats. And so the circle here, the red circle, amphipods comprised the highest component of their diet next to zooplankton. Zooplankton are the little microscopic critters in the water, good indicators of pollution, but really important in freshwater food webs. But these amphipods, which decline in high salt concentrations, are important for yellow perch, especially in Adirondack Park lakes. And I'd have to look at a little bit of data from Lake Erie to speculate more on this. But so this kind of begs the question, like, if we lose these invertebrates and things in the water that people don't really often see or think about, what could happen to the species that we do prize, right? In terms of angling or over in Canadian waters, commercial fisheries, things like that. So if we have a no salt environment, we show yellow perch eat these amphipods. And in a high salt environment, if we lose some of these amphipods, some of this fish food, so to speak, would we get slower growing, smaller adults, fewer smaller offspring, reduction in abundance? So when we think about lakes like Lake Erie or even inland waters or just lakes generally throughout the United States, this is one thing we are trying to forecast now based on our experimental results is what are the implications for our freshwater fisheries when we when we lose some of those organisms in freshwater environments. So another aspect of salt pollution is macroalgae is critically important for things like those amphipods and for young fish to hide in. So it's fish and invertebrate habitat. And so this other graph shows a precipitous decline in this freshwater macroalgae species, which is important to the functioning of freshwater ecosystems. But as we increase the salt concentration, we can see almost that macroalgae almost entirely disappears. So this is gonna this in highly contaminated lakes would likely be a problem. You'd see a reduction in possibly freshwater macrophytes and macroalgae species that are important to a whole host of organisms in the lake ecosystem. We've done some experimentation just on rainbow trout, and rainbow trout are technically a Pacific salmonid species, right? They should be able to tolerate high salt concentrations, but when you hit them with salt during the younger stages, so what we see in the center here is what we would call an alvin, and then they grow, and what we found is that after 25 days after an exposure to high road salt concentrations, they're about 3/4 of the size as their brothers and sisters that have not seen any road salt whatsoever. So when you hit things with road salt, during specific life stages, they don't have the kidney function, the gill function um, that older fish, developed fish do. And so that can trigger kind of a decline in their growth rates. And really, it's, what could happen over the long term to our fisheries is kind of one of the questions we're trying to ask about this. Government guidelines. Another question we're addressing, one is, do federal thresholds for different types of salts protect freshwater ecosystems? So if we look at Canada and the United States, those are the two lowest chronic thresholds around the globe that we know of. And so keep these in mind, the 120 milligrams of chloride per liter and the 230 milligrams of chloride per liter. These are thresholds that are supposed to protect sensitive freshwater organisms, okay? And so when we test this out, me and a bunch of colleagues from Europe and North America, Canada, the United States, and Europe, we took a bunch of organisms, zooplankton in this case, and we exposed them to a range of salt concentrations. So what you see here are our study sites from California, the eastern and central United States, as well as Canada, and then some of the study sites in Europe, right? Spain and Sweden specifically. And so we exposed zooplankton from all of these sites from natural lake ecosystems to road salt, sodium chloride road salt. And to orient you here a little bit, on the x-axis is our study site, all those sites you just saw on the previous graph. On the y-axis is the percent change in abundance of these zooplankton, cladocerans specifically. So cladocerans, all fish species at the early life stages essentially eat cladoceran zooplankton, okay? And some fish species throughout their entire life only consume zooplankton as their primary diet item. And so the dashed line in the middle represents an increase in the abundance, and below that dashed line, it represents a decrease in abundance. And then the blue dots and the error bars represent the Canadian threshold, and the gold ones, yellow ones, kind of represent the US threshold of 230. So long story short, these thresholds established by the Canadian government and the U.S. government, which are they're the U.S. threshold was developed in 1988, and it maybe needs a little revising. But when it comes to these zooplankton communities at these study sites, anyway, what we see is a massive loss of cladoceran zooplankton and diversity. You can read the full paper there down in the bottom right if you're interested. But these are critically important for the functioning of freshwater ecosystems. They take all the algae, they transform it into their own biomass, then they're consumed by fish, etc., and other organisms. And so what we see is that a lot of these study sites, there's almost a 50% or more loss in the abundance of these critters at these thresholds designed to protect freshwater organisms. So I think maybe we need to work towards thinking about revising these thresholds for some freshwater ecosystems. This is a long story. I'm happy to discuss further if anybody's interested. Um, but I only have so much time for this workshop today, so I should get moving. Um, and what we find is that when we lose those zooplankton, like you see here on the left, that's the cladoceran, a typical Daphnia, right? Is that when you lose them at 40% of the study sites, we got an increase in algae, okay? And so what we lose is that grazing pressure, we lose foraging rate, and what you get is this increase in algal concentration. And so we don't quite know the species of algae that are increasing, but that's more work that needs to be done. So we go from kind of a clear water phase to, well, there's more algae in the water and it's a little more green, okay? Now, one of the concerns and one of the things we're trying to forecast is if you look here towards the left and you see that X through the zooplankton, if we lose those zooplankton, are we going to lose the fish that feed solely on the zooplankton, or are we going to lose the large fish that feed on the small fish that feed on the zooplankton? Okay, and you can see this is my sister's husband holding a muskie up there. Loves to fish for muskie, but one thing we need to ask about our highly contaminated lake ecosystems, or those that might be under threat from salt contamination, is how is that going to affect the food chain or the food web? And so if we go back to the right here, these are some of the things we've noticed so far to date. You get reduced zooplankton abundance, you get an increase in algal biomass from reduced herbivory or reduced foraging rate. That can shade out the water column. We've seen direct effects on invertebrate production, all those critters at the bottom of the lake, some effects on macroalgae, the kind of plant looking stuff on here. And we have seen a reduced, fish size for some species and some salts at some concentrations. And so the science is kind of painting a picture of potential, changes in freshwater ecosystems due to various salt types and various concentrations. So a lot more work to be done, but this is just kind of what we're thinking about, what we're synthesizing, putting the pieces of the puzzle together. So here in northwestern Ohio, in the Toledo area, in the Maumee area of concern, we've established a collaboration. And if you're interested, talk with Bob Miltner with the Ohio EPA there in your audience. He's a brilliant scientist and well versed in the impacts of salt pollution and things like that. So, but this collaboration we kind of established, a couple of years ago to figure out how do we address. I showed you this graph before. How do we address salt pollution in this area? And so, one way is to leverage a series of best management practices here that you see on the right. And many of you probably are engaging in these best management practices, but if you can leverage as many of these as possible, the use of live edge plows, anti-icing, calibration is a huge thing. You can save so much material and money by leveraging these best management practices, um, that we can really reduce the amount of salt going into freshwater ecosystems. And I think that right now is probably our best bet. We have to do this on a massive scale, however, because road salts, like I said, they reduce our accident rates and they keep you, me, our friends, and our family safe. So, what's the solution to the problem? One of them is leveraging a suite of best management practices, probably as many as you can do. But there's not always the funding, the person power, to do these best management practices. So one thing we're investigating here in Northwestern Ohio is how do we develop projects and funding opportunities to say, let's get the best possible equipment, newer equipment, people to calibrate equipment, and you probably use trucks for multiple purposes, right? Just like every other, agency. So, I mean, it's how do we create the environment to implement best management practices, um, you know, en masse and, make sure that, road managers and applicators are supported to do it, right? So, yeah. But if we think, I spoke about the ecology, and one thing I also like to mention, before I go, is that road salts have a lot of economic costs to them, right? And so I saw a recent statistic that was developed, I think, in Wisconsin, that $1 in road salt leads to about $10 in damage. You think about rust on your cars, bridges, roads, making pavement, more kind of degrading our pavement and things like that. And so there's a lot of economic damage here as well that we can think about when we try to use road salts in a smart way, right? Leveraging those best management practices. And then there's our water supplies. And there are several case studies coming out of New York where some wells, for example, were just unusable because they were too polluted with salt, right? And so I don't know if any of you have had this problem in Ohio, but it can cost a lot of money to fix infrastructure for drinking water supplies. And I'm not a medical professional, but when we think about sodium, which accompanies a lot of the salts, we need to think about human health, people with hypertension, kidney disease, things like that. Because, we got to keep our fresh water fresh. All right. Um, so I want to thank you all for letting me be a part of your workshop today. And I'm happy to talk with you more about this. I hope maybe at some point I can be there in person for something. But that's my email. Feel free to reach out to me if you want. And a lot of this work has been funded by a cool project through the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency and the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, to address salt pollution. And like I said at the beginning of this, our Great Lakes are the most valuable resource we have, and the largest source of fresh water, and we need to protect it, right? And so feel free to reach out, contact me at the email address above. And like I said, I think Bob Miltner might be with you as well. And if he is, reach out to him. He's involved in this project. And I think, we just need to work together on this because it's not a scientist. It's not a politician. It's not just a road manager. It's not just, the level of service from the public that's going to solve this. It's going to take us all, and it's going to take a multi-pronged approach for quite some time to fix this issue or to address this issue. But thanks again. I hope you all have a good one. Take it easy.